The house had fallen into this strange kind of silence, the kind that doesn't comfort you, but follows you like a shadow. Every step I took felt like an echo in a place that used to be filled with laughter, music, conversations at dinner. Now it was just the soft hum of oxygen machines, the clink of medication bottles, the occasional creak of floorboards beneath tired feet. I moved gently around him, always careful, always present. There were flowers, too, I made sure of that. Fresh ones, every week. Just because sickness had taken over didn't mean beauty had to disappear. Loving him meant tending to every little thing, the sponge baths, the medicine schedule, the sleepless nights. I never thought twice. I never asked why me. We met when I was 22. He was magnetic, charming in a way that made people lean in, not away. And me? I was the calm in his chaos. I didn't need to shine like he did. I just needed to be close enough to feel his warmth. We built a life from scratch, coffee every morning, matching slippers, soft touches in the hallway. When the doctor said it was terminal, I didn't flinch. I just nodded and started making lists. I didn't love him for his health. I loved him for who he was and who we were together. So I became everything he needed. Nurse, wife, caretaker, protector. Not because I had to, because I couldn't imagine doing anything less. He died on a Tuesday morning. It was raining. I remember that because I was staring out the window when his breathing slowed, and I thought, how fitting. Even the sky is grieving. I held his hand, whispering to him that it was okay to let go. My voice didn't shake. I wanted my strength to be the last thing he felt. When his chest stopped rising, I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there, still holding on, even though he was already gone. I had given him everything I had, and in that moment, I felt empty, but also proud. I kept my promise. I stayed. I loved him through the very end. After the funeral, people kept telling me how brave I was. Brave, as if I'd had a choice. What they didn't see were the nights I collapsed on the bathroom floor, muffling my sobs into a towel so he wouldn't hear. Or how many times I'd smiled through exhaustion, just so he wouldn't feel like a burden. I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow, like a shell of the woman I used to be. But still, I thanked them. I nodded. I accepted their casseroles and their condolences and the way they tiptoed around me, unsure of how to talk about a man I'd loved for nearly 4 decades. There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just settles into your bones. That's what it felt like when I woke up alone that first morning. His side of the bed untouched. His slippers still tucked neatly under the dresser. I caught myself reaching for his hand, calling his name to ask what he wanted for breakfast. Habits don't break just because hearts do, but I pushed forward, day by day, sorting through the paperwork, canceling appointments, returning medical supplies. I told myself that if I could just handle the logistics, maybe the grief would follow a checklist too. Spoiler, it doesn't. Still, I believed I was doing the right thing, closing out our chapter with grace, honoring the life we shared. I made an appointment with Richard's lawyer, ready to tie up the loose ends. Nothing extravagant. I wasn't expecting yachts or secret fortunes, just the house we built together, the life insurance we agreed on, the retirement account we both contributed to. It wasn't about the money, it was about closure. I needed to hold on to something that proved our life had meant something, that I had meant something, and I thought, foolishly, that I was finally at the part of this story where the worst had already happened. Walking into the lawyer's office felt strange, like stepping into a world that didn't know Richard had stopped breathing. Everything looked so normal: polished floors, ticking clock, a receptionist smiling too politely. I sat down across from Mr. Lawson, a man we'd both trusted for years, and I felt this quiet readiness settle over me. I'd come prepared with a folder full of documents, a pen, even a list of questions. This was supposed to be the easy part. The part where, for once, things made sense again. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for signatures and numbers and legal terms I barely understood. But instead, he hesitated. Just for a second. Enough for my stomach to twist. He cleared his throat and looked at me. Not with pity, not with professionalism, but something else. Hesitation, maybe. Guilt? Mrs. Harper, he began, his voice lower than usual. Before we begin, there's something you need to know. And that's when my fingers went cold. It was like my body knew, before my mind could catch up, that something was wrong. Deeply, impossibly wrong. I sat up straighter, heart pounding so loudly I barely heard the next sentence, but I caught her name. Elise Monroe. And suddenly, the room didn't feel so normal anymore. My ears were ringing. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. Another woman? Everything left to her. Real estate, investments, savings, all in someone else's name? I blinked, trying to stay calm, trying not to collapse right there on that cold leather chair. And then, the part that truly shattered me. It seems, she was his long-term partner. The documents were signed over a year ago. A year ago. While I was feeding him, bathing him, sleeping in hospital chairs, loving him without pause, that's when he left me. Not when he died, but when he chose her. I didn't speak, not at first. I just stared at him, Mr. Lawson, like maybe if I waited long enough, he'd take it back. That he'd say it was a mistake, or a misprint, or some cruel clerical error. But no. His eyes stayed on mine, soft but unwavering, like he'd seen this happen before. I swallowed hard. My throat burned. Elise Monroe. A name I'd never heard before, and yet it now lived in the center of my world, wrecking everything I thought I knew. I managed to whisper, "Who is she?" And even as I asked, part of me didn't want the answer. He hesitated again, flipping through the papers like maybe the words would rearrange themselves. "We believe she was romantically involved with your husband for quite some time," he said. "There are documents, bank transfers, properties. She was listed as his primary beneficiary over a year ago." Over a year ago. That phrase hit like a slap. I thought back. 1 year ago, Richard was in and out of the hospital. I was learning how to manage his pain. I was writing birthday cards for him when he was too tired to hold a pen. And he was leaving our life, my life, in the hands of someone else. I stood up, but my knees almost gave out. My hand grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. I remember hearing a soft buzzing in my ears, like the world had pulled back from me. This wasn't just betrayal. This was erasure. I wasn't his wife in the end. Not in the eyes of the law, not on paper, not in the legacy he left behind. I'd poured myself into him until there was nothing left, and now I was being told, calmly, in a beige office under fluorescent lights, that none of it mattered. He didn't choose me, not even in death. And in that moment, grief turned into something colder, something sharper. I walked out of that office in a daze. The sun was too bright, the air too warm. Everything around me felt wrong, like the world should have been mourning too. I got into my car, turned the key, and just sat there. I stared straight ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from flying apart. Elise Monroe. That name repeated in my head like a song I hated but couldn't turn off. I tried to picture her. Younger, maybe. Prettier. Healthier. Someone who hadn't wiped vomit from his lips or held his hand through morphine tremors. Was she with him while I was making soup in the kitchen? While I was laying out his medication? I thought back to the moments when Richard would drift off during conversations, or when he'd get quiet after checking his phone. I used to chalk it up to fatigue, to pain, to fear. I never imagined he was drifting away into someone else's arms, even in sickness. I had protected his dignity every step of the way. And now I was left with none of my own. Every memory felt tainted. Every "I love you" now sounded hollow. Every kiss, a lie he'd rehearsed more than once. But even in my heartbreak, something inside me refused to crumble. I wasn't going to be the quiet little widow who disappeared after the funeral. No. If she had taken everything, I needed to know who she was, what she was, and why he had chosen her over me. So I started digging. Phone records, emails, credit card statements. I knew where he kept things. I knew how to read between the lines. And as the pieces began falling into place, I found something that made me freeze. A financial transfer dated the same day I took him to the ER for respiratory failure. While I was crying in a hospital bathroom, he was giving her money. I didn't cry. Not the way people expect you to. No screaming, no throwing things. The pain was too deep for that. It settled in like a fog I couldn't see through. But there was something else too, just underneath the sorrow, disbelief, then anger, and finally, a flicker of clarity. I'd been made into a footnote in my own life. This woman, this Elise, had stolen not just my husband's affection, but his legacy. And I couldn't let that be the final word. So I wrote her name down on a blank sheet of paper, circled it, and underlined it twice. I needed to see it. I needed it to be real. It didn't take long to find her. A quick search, a few connections, and there she was. Elise Monroe. A polished woman with expensive taste and a perfectly curated life. Her social media was filled with vacation photos, charity gala selfies, and captions about gratitude. Gratitude. I nearly laughed. I looked into her eyes on that screen and imagined how she must have felt when he died, relieved she didn't have to share him anymore, proud of what she'd gained. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She must have thought I'd fade quietly into the background, too heartbroken to fight. But I didn't feel broken anymore. Not in that moment. I felt awake. If Richard had thought he could rewrite our story with a few signatures and a secret affair, he was wrong. I had loved him fiercely, completely, and I had done so without conditions. But now I needed answers. I needed justice. And more than anything, I needed to look that woman in the eye and let her know I was still here. The wife. The one who stayed. The one who buried him. And I wasn't going anywhere. When I finally met her, I expected to feel something explosive. Rage, jealousy, maybe even fear. But standing there, face to face with Elise Monroe, all I felt was cold. Not numbness, but precision. She opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her house was beautiful, just like I'd imagined. Designer furniture, tasteful art, everything in its place. She was exactly the woman you'd expect a man like Richard to fall for in a moment of weakness, or maybe a moment of desperation. But I didn't care about her charm or her expensive perfume. I was there for the truth. She offered me tea. Can you believe that? Tea. As if this were some polite social visit between acquaintances. I declined. Sat down, looked her in the eye and said, "You knew he was married." She didn't flinch. She tilted her head and said, "He told me you were more like a nurse than a wife by the end." That hit like a slap, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't embarrassed. She was smug, as if she'd won, as if Richard had picked her, and in her mind, that made her untouchable. But I didn't scream. I didn't break. I just watched her. And in that silence, something shifted. She thought I was weak. She thought I'd be crushed under grief, too broken to do anything but disappear. That was her first mistake. I had loved a man through death. I had carried his pain, bathed his body, and held his soul. She'd played dress-up with the fantasy of being the one, while I lived the truth of it. And now I wasn't mourning anymore. I was watching, listening, learning. Because while Elise Monroe drank her tea with manicured fingers, I was already plotting how to burn down everything she thought she owned. When I left her house, I didn't slam the door. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out with her smile still burning in my mind, so sure of herself, so certain I'd crawl back into my little grief-stricken shell. But she had no idea who I used to be before Richard got sick, before hospital beds replaced our couch and medication schedules ruled my day. I was sharp. I handled contracts, estate matters, investments. I knew where the money was, how the paperwork worked, and most importantly, I knew Richard. Maybe not the man he became in the end, but the one he used to be. And I knew his tells, his blind spots, his secrets. I went back home and pulled out every file, every email, every bank statement I'd tucked away in a box labeled later. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for at first. Just a feeling, like there had to be something out of place. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Transaction dates that didn't make sense. A transfer signed on a day when Richard couldn't even sit up in bed. Investment shifts he never discussed with me, made during late nights I'd spent massaging his legs to ease the tremors. It didn't feel like carelessness. It felt like manipulation. Someone else's hand had guided him, and I had a sick feeling I knew whose. That's when I found it. A copy of a signature on one of the legal forms. Shaky, uneven, almost childlike. It wasn't his. Not really. I'd watched Richard sign checks for decades. He had a flourish in his R, a specific way of slanting the H in Harper. This one looked off, as if someone had tried to mimic it, and badly. My heart raced, my breath caught. It wasn't just betrayal. It might be fraud. I printed every copy, highlighted the discrepancies, and picked up the phone. I called a lawyer. Not the kind that handles death certificates, the kind that handles war. The first time I met with my attorney, I laid everything out on the table, literally. Documents, timelines, copies of signatures, screenshots of transfers, even notes scribbled in my own shaky handwriting from the nights I couldn't sleep. She listened without interrupting, her brows slowly knitting together as the picture took shape. "This isn't just suspicious," she finally said. "This is a case." And there it was, validation. Proof that my gut wasn't lying, that I hadn't imagined the chill behind Elise's smile or the quiet cruelty of a man I once thought incapable of deceit. I wasn't crazy. I was right. From that point on, I stopped waiting for grief to pass. I stopped replaying the final moments of Richard's life like a tragic love story. Instead, I documented. I researched. I gathered. I became my own investigator, every day turning over stones I never wanted to look under. I found emails, some encrypted, others carelessly deleted but easily recovered. I traced account activity that Elise never thought anyone would question. I mapped out the timeline from the moment of Richard's diagnosis to the last transfer she received. There were gaps, glaring ones, enough to raise doubts in any courtroom. But I didn't rush. That was the key. Elise had expected a storm. Tears, confrontation, emotional outbursts. She didn't see the quiet coming. She didn't expect the stillness. The long pause before the thunder. But that's where I live now, in the quiet, in the gathering strength. The woman who sat beside a dying man for a year knows how to wait, knows how to endure. So while she smiled for cameras and spent her stolen fortune on designer handbags, I prepared, not for closure, not for comfort, for justice. Courtrooms are colder than I imagined, not just the temperature, but the energy. Sterile, detached. I sat there in my neatly pressed black suit, documents in one hand, and Richard's wedding band in the other, as if holding it might remind me why I started this. Across the room, Elise Monroe wore a sleek gray dress and red lipstick, her hair pulled back like she was attending a photo shoot, not a fraud hearing. She didn't look at me once, not even as the judge read out the allegations: manipulation of a mentally compromised man, possible forgery, unethical influence. My hands stayed still. My voice never shook. We presented everything: emails that contradicted her story, bank statements dated during his hospital stays, a signature analysis from a forensic specialist confirming what I'd already known in my bones. That wasn't Richard's hand on the will. It was hers, or someone she paid. I watched her shift in her seat for the first time, lips tightening. Her attorney objected to everything, of course, tried to spin it as love, as devotion. He wanted her to be cared for, they argued. He made a choice. But I knew better. And so did the judge. Especially when the nurse from Richard's final days took the stand and testified to his confusion, his decline, how he barely remembered the day of the alleged signing. When the judge ordered a freeze on all assets pending investigation, Elise's mask cracked. Just a flicker, her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed. She didn't expect this. She thought her story would hold. that her charm and the advantage of the dead man's silence would carry her through. But now she was exposed, vulnerable, and the best part? I hadn't even started speaking publicly yet. That was next. While she scrambled to protect what she'd taken, I was preparing a truth she couldn't bury. A story the world needed to hear, one that began with love and ended in betrayal. The first time I told my story publicly, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, my hands trembling just enough to blur the edges of the notepad in front of me. I wasn't used to cameras, microphones, or the glare of online attention, but the words came easily, because they were mine. I told them about Richard, the man I loved, the man I nursed, the man I buried. I spoke about the betrayal, not as a scandal, but as a wound. And people listened. They saw me not as a bitter widow, but as a woman robbed of dignity, of legacy, of truth. And the internet responded. Within days, the story exploded. "The widow betrayed," the headline said. Talk shows called, bloggers wrote op-eds, women reached out, hundreds of them. Some had lost money, others, their marriages, but all of them had lost something they were told to quietly accept. I wasn't alone anymore. The silence Elise had counted on cracked beneath the sound of collective outrage. She was painted not just as a mistress, but as a manipulator, a thief who preyed on a dying man's vulnerability. Every photo of her smiling at charity galas now looked calculated. Every vacation post, a display of stolen luxury. And while she tried to hide, to downplay, to delete, my case moved forward. My attorney filed for full recovery of the estate under grounds of fraud, undue influence, and forged documentation. We submitted affidavits. We brought in handwriting experts. And Elise? She began to crumble. Her accounts were scrutinized. Her lawyers quit. 2 of them, back to back. By the time she sat down for her deposition, she was no longer polished. She was pale, defensive, and visibly unraveling. She looked at me then, really looked, and I could almost see it, the moment she realized she hadn't just underestimated a widow. She'd awakened a storm. The verdict didn't come with fanfare. Just a quiet gavel strike and a few firm words from the judge. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff. I closed my eyes, not in triumph, but in relief. A kind of peace I hadn't felt in over a year washed through me. The court froze Elise's accounts permanently. The estate, our home, our savings, every asset Richard had once tried to bury with someone else, was returned. Not as a gift, not as a consolation, as a correction. The record was finally right again. My name, back where it belonged. My place in our story, restored. Elise didn't wait for the press outside. She slipped through a side door with her new lawyer, hair unbrushed, dark sunglasses hiding what little dignity she had left. She had spent a year building a fantasy on the ruins of my life. Now she'd spend years untangling lawsuits, debts, and the fallout of her own greed. And me? I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to scream, or point, or gloat. I had the truth. And the world saw it too. That was enough. More than enough. She thought she could erase me, but instead, she erased herself. As I walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones, cameras, questions. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been written. In court records, in news articles, in the way people looked at me now. Not with pity, but with respect. I got into my car, turned the key, and for the first time in months, drove without shaking hands. I was heading home. And for the first time since Richard's death, I felt like it was mine again. The day the house was officially put back in my name, I stood at the gate for a long time before opening it. Something about seeing the deed with just my name on it, no Richard, no co-signature, felt strange, but not wrong. It wasn't a victory I celebrated with champagne. There were no toasts, no photos. Just the soft sound of gravel beneath my feet as I walked back into the place where so much love and so much pain had lived. The same walls, the same creaky floorboard in the hallway. But it felt different now. Not haunted, just quiet. Peaceful. Mine. I spent the next few weeks doing something no one had seen coming: giving. Not to lawyers, not to PR firms, to people who needed it. I took a portion of the recovered estate and set up a fund for hospice care workers. The kind who had held my hand when I cried in hospital hallways. The kind who had treated Richard with compassion when he couldn't speak for himself. I named it after him. Not because he deserved the honor, but because they did. And I wanted every nurse, every family, every patient to know: love isn't just a word you say when it's easy. Sometimes it's the last thing you give, even after everything else is gone. People called me brave again. I accepted it differently this time. Not as a compliment, but as a reflection. I wasn't brave because I fought back. I was brave because I endured. Because I didn't let what he did define who I became. I still had nights where I cried, still had moments where his voice echoed in my mind, but they didn't own me anymore. Neither did Elise. The story they tried to rewrite had been corrected, and the woman they tried to erase was standing, quietly, on her own front porch, with the keys in her hand and her head held high. I didn't talk about Richard much after that. Not to friends, not in interviews. He became something quieter inside me, like an old photograph you don't frame, but still keep tucked in a drawer. Sometimes I'd catch myself remembering a moment that still made me smile, the way he used to hum while shaving, or how he always read the newspaper out loud, as if I wasn't reading it beside him. Those memories were still mine, untainted by his choices. That's the part no mistress, no will, no betrayal could take from me. I loved him. And that love had existed. But I didn't owe it my life anymore. Elise disappeared from the public eye. No more glossy photos, no charity galas, no smug interviews. Her name faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals, louder stories. But I still got updates. Little whispers. She sold her car, moved to a smaller apartment, started liquidating things just to cover her legal fees. There was no joy in watching her fall, only finality. She had taken so much, but she hadn't won. Because even if she'd managed to steal the money, she never touched the love I gave. She never earned the right to be part of that chapter, no matter how hard she tried to write herself in. What I did feel, though, was clarity. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's decisions. I was writing my own pages now. Planting things in the garden just because I liked the colors, repainting the bedroom, laughing more with my sister. I even took a short trip, just me, a quiet cabin, and a journal full of empty pages. I didn't need to run away from the past. I just needed to live beyond it. And slowly, almost gently, I began to. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic, sorting through boxes I hadn't touched since before Richard got sick. Old letters, faded cards, photo albums filled with birthdays and beach trips and blurry Christmas mornings. Near the bottom of one box, I found our wedding photo. I stared at it for a long time. I looked so young, so sure. He did too. I ran my thumb over the edge of the frame and thought about everything that had come since. Every joy, every betrayal, every breath I'd taken after he took his last. And then, without sadness, without anger, I opened the drawer of the hallway table and placed it inside. That drawer clicked shut with a finality I hadn't expected. Not painful, not dramatic, just finished. Not forgotten, not erased, just no longer on display. I didn't need to stare at our wedding picture to remember who I was. I had proven it, again and again. In grief, in battle, in quiet resilience. I had survived the kind of heartbreak that shatters women, and instead of shrinking, I had stood taller. I had chosen to rebuild, not just what was taken, but who I wanted to be going forward, and that was a version of myself no one could touch. As I stepped outside that evening, I looked at the house, the home I now owned. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds, and for the first time in a long time, the air felt warm on my skin. Not heavy, not cold, just alive. I took a deep breath, turned the key in the lock, and whispered to myself, "He died with her in his heart, but I buried him with his name and left with everything else."